Hello, everybody. Welcome back to an episode of Gaming the System, the podcast where three intersectional feminists examine gaming through a feminist lens. Today, we are myself, Matt, Alex, and Jan, and we're going to be talking about games that don't have any violence in them at all. No combat, no physical threat of any kind, even if it's cartoon. So have that percolating in your brains as you think, hang on, how many games do I actually play that have no element of violence in them whatsoever? Because that's what I had to do, and it takes a while. So before we start, two extremely exciting things. The extra exciting thing is Gaming the System is doing a live show in Cardiff on either the 9th or the 10th of September 2023 at the Anime and Comic Con. So that will be the original lineup of the three of us plus Caroline. She's going to be coming on, and we're going to have a chat about something, whatever it is, we don't know yet. So 9th to the 10th of September, Cardiff. And then, as always, our Patreon, which you can find at patreon.com/gamingthesystem, where you've got a couple of interesting special stuff. We've done a lost God of War episode that I forgot to release on the main. Alex and I tearing into Avatar Way of Water, and a few other ones as well. So patreon.com/gamingthesystem. Right, with the business out of the way. First question. In your gaming histories, we've all been gaming for a couple of decades now. What percentage of the games that you've played in total do you think have no violence in them?
Good question. That's a good question. Probably quite a small percentage. I'd say, well, actually, if I was being absolutely generous, I'd say somewhere around the region of 25%. And that's very generous. But when I think about types of games, it's things like Abzu, Journey, Professor Layton games, puzzle games, things like that. Very story-based games. So I'm trying to think of one. Firewatch, technically, that's another one. I don't think What Remains of Edith Finch is entirely violence-free because it deals with some very dark topics.
Yeah.
And violence to other characters, not necessarily the central character you're playing. So maybe we could eliminate that one off the list. But yeah, definitely there's a theme running amongst a lot of those games, but I'd say being generous, 25%. Yeah.
I thought because this is an extremely it's not the mainstream at all to have no violence in games. I thought what it would be like if we were very strict with ourselves in this, in going to, because it's really important to point out this great big elephant in the room. The vast majority of games are violent. So what happens when we zoom in on the qualities of ones that don't contain any violence? Jem, how about you? What's your percentage?
So are we saying that things like Edith, because in Edith Finch, the player doesn't carry out any violence, but as you say, there is violence present. So are we saying that doesn't, that isn't part of this? Is that okay?
I think we'll restrict it to maybe the player. Violence doesn't happen. You don't see violence. The player doesn't commit violence. So it can be like an entirely narrative thing, but without gameplay violence, physical threat.
Yeah. So I think in that case, I think probably slightly higher. I think I'm nearer to the 40% of non-violent games. There's, say, the story-based games, and there's little puzzler. There's little games like Monkey Island. There's
yeah.
those sorts of games. I played quite a lot. Gabriel Knight and those kind of point and click adventures. And again, there's no violence in those. I know. I'm obviously a gamer.
See, I think it's more like around the 10% for me.
Wow. Yeah.
Because if I think back about, so we've been doing this for 2.5 years now. I could, if I was to just write a list of the games I've heard you both talk about, what I talk about, what Caroline's talked about, I could list off innumerable ones that have violence in them, and I would struggle to, like, in terms of the amount of time spent talking about things. So Alex and I have talked about God of War for nearly 3 hours in just the two of us talking. And Jen, you and I, we've talked about The Last of Us for nearly 3 hours.
Yeah, that's quite violent.
A little bit, yeah. It's interesting.
Sims and there's,
or even like racing games. It could be something like that.
Yeah, and then I think, well, Crash Team Racing, for example, but then you have to go, no, you throw bombs at each other. And
that's true.
Mario Kart, that's throwing things at each other, physically impacting things. Things with particularly a gameplay element that it revolves around physically impacting something else.
What about Just Dance? Have you played Just Dance?
No.
I have.
No, I have as well. Yeah.
See, that's fine.
And all the sports, FIFA and all of that are hugely popular. They don't have violence in. But then you've got Call of Duty. It's also hugely popular. Fortnite, a lot of violence in those. I mean, it'd be really interesting, wouldn't it? Actually, just games, like realistic, hardcore, adult violence versus jokey violence, like you said, versus violence where there is a violent thing so you don't see it, or you're not. I mean, I remember them years ago. There was a big, I can't remember which game it was about, but there was a big one of the big releases, and they just changed the blood from red to green, and it got downgraded a level in its age rating because it was viewed as being okay, and then it was like, then it didn't have to be an 18. So there are levels, aren't there? And so I think it's really interesting, actually. But from a game mechanic perspective, I think it's a big thing of the combat, whether it be throwing bombs at your race mates or stabbing someone with a sword.
That's a really interesting, because again, like we talk a lot about violence, and the reason I wanted to do this topic is because we've had quite a heavy month in terms of the topics we've been doing, and it's been quite a long May, so I wanted to try and do something that wouldn't get me all riled up. So
I'm sure we can get you riled up.
We'll find something in it. Please don't make that your goal for this session. Because there's you think, like Crash Bandicoot, for example, you're spinning into crabs. That doesn't count as real violence, but it's still it's combat. It is physical conflict as part of the gameplay mechanic, even though you can't argue that will impart any kind of particular violence to people. And I remember very clearly the Call of Duty World at War on PS3 which was I think it was 2009. It was the first game that came after the first Modern Warfare game, and it was set in World War II. And it was the first game ever to have dismemberment mechanics. So when someone got blown up, their legs could come off. And
Yeah.
now that's, again, it's a setting like you can toggle whether there's gore on. You can toggle dismemberment.
That's right.
And there's an interesting conversation to be had about why that matters. Why is one seems more sanitary than the other? So the different grades of physical stuff.
Yeah.
So interestingly enough, you both said, I would have guessed around 10% for both of you, based on our conversations. But do you feel like you played more less violent games when you were younger and then grew up into violent games, or the other way around, or how is it like changed over time?
That's a really interesting question. I smiled there when you asked, because I know the very first, well, a lot of the regular listeners will know my very earliest gaming is one of the most violent games that you can play, which is the original Tomb Raider, which of course features a lot of violence and a lot of guns and shooting and all that sort of thing. But I also played a lot of non-violent games, which we have discussed on the pod previously when we talk about educational games. Like my mum used to buy things like from M&S, those packs on maths and English, and like Wallace and Gromit, and stuff. Just fun little puzzle games and things. So yeah, I guess I'd say it was probably about more like 50-50, I think, in my childhood. And then obviously as I've got older, I've gravitated more towards like the big AAA action adventure type ones, but obviously still love like puzzles and story games and things. But obviously, it's all sorts of different factors that kind of motivate me to play one game over another. But I wouldn't be without non-violent games, because they provide an experience that is obviously inherently more relaxing. And is just, it's what you're in the mood for. It's something of what you fancy. So I think it's really important to have that mix of genres in your gaming library. Yeah. So I wouldn't be without non-violent games, but I do feel like I have a higher percentage of violent games in my current gaming catalogue, as it were. So yeah, that's what I think from my childhood anyway.
How about you, Jim?
Well, I was just thinking about this. Obviously, I was playing in my childhood. It was all text-based games. So and so but that's not to say there wasn't violence in there. There was often killing things. Normally, things killing you, but it was usually like beating things up with a sword. Hit with sword. And then I had a real gap because I didn't do console gaming, and I didn't, and computer games were so basic then. I was playing games, as I said, like point and click adventures, which were more and more like the original Key Island, and extremistic Leisure Suit Larry games, and and Day of the Tentacle, and various games like that were all sort of, and then I got series which is sort of really cool, sort of again, point and click stuff. So a lot of point and click, and I think probably the first sort of violent game that I played would have been Chrono Trigger, which is one of the very early Final Fantasy games, and that that was, you know, fighting monsters. And so yeah, and then I think then I went into a sort of into an area where it was more violent. So, you know, it was like Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights, and then often played Tomb Raider and the Resident Evils. Obviously, they're hugely violent. But I think it's interesting because it's not been a sort of like in my childhood and then in my adulthood I've done this, because I now sort of come back to a much more between the two, and I actually find the very heavily violent games quite like, I did find the level of violence in The Last of Us 2 a little bit over the top. I felt like, why am I going through killing all these people? You know, just killing. I mean, killing monsters is one thing, but killing humans is another thing. And it was, and I know it's a very cold-blooded world, and it's all justified within the story, but it definitely, from time to time, and there are definitely times where I feel like, oh, you know, see, it's easy for game designers to just put in like, oh, you have to kill X amount of months ago, get this thing, than it is to come up with a complicated storyline that your character has to, you know, go through. And I think, but I do like games that have a little bit of combat in and a little bit of puzzling in and have a good balance. I'm playing, I think, you know, I play a few violent games, play board games in physically, and also on the computer. I'm playing quite a lot of board games on the computer, and then I think my most violent gaming these days happens in my well, it's not tabletop, it's role-playing games that I play, where there's a lot of violence happens in those. Probably the most violent games that I play now that I finished Last of Us 2. Just haven't started a new console game. I think a lot of the console games, my console gaming is quite violent, except for on the Switch. Yeah, so I think it's kind of like probably like 80% non-violent games to probably like 80% violent games, and then now it's about 40-60 non-violent violent, or maybe even the other way around sometimes. So yeah.
I think The Last of Us 2 is probably the best, the most impactful violence in a game has been for me, because it's they shout the names of the people you kill, and you just go on and on, killing and killing and killing, and you see all these different examples of characters who have just, their lives just revolve around just killing and killing and killing and brutalization and murder. And it's a real, like, it's a real treatise on violence. So I really appreciate that from that particular game. It felt like it was, rather than just being violence as a game mechanic, it was really wanted to make you think about what you were doing.
Yeah.
Which brings a question. I'll swap these questions around. Oh no, I'll keep it the way it was, and I'll come back to that thought that I just had. What are the non-violent games that have impacted you the most? What are the ones that, when you because there are a lot of non-violent games like Journey and Abzu, and they're really small, and it feels rarer to find a big non-game without any violence in that can really have a significant impact on you compared to like a big AAA game. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, I think I've spoken on the pod before about how much I love Journey. And I watched a PlayStation showcase recently, which had a trailer for the kind of next game in that series, if you will. It's like by the same developers, and it's got the same composer in Austin Wintory, and it's called Sword of the Sea. And it's like a combination of Abzu and Journey, because it's like partly sand, part water, and you're like, it's almost like a skateboard, but it's on a sword. You're like a hover sword, and you're like floating around like that. So I'm quite looking forward to that one. But I think one of the key things is the fact that it's the same developers and the same composer of the music, because the music was one of the most impactful things about Journey for me. That really kind of brought the whole concept together, and it was definitely one of the most emotional games I think I've ever played to date. That impacted me as I was playing it for the very first time, because I had no idea what to expect. And that's what I like about those types of games, is there's not really much information on like what you're actually doing. You kind of figure it out as you go along. And that kind of series with Abzu, and then also now with the Pathless, which I actually haven't finished and need to finish, and then now Sword of the Sea, which is coming out I think later this year or next year. I can't quite remember. But yeah, that's quite a big series for me. And then I guess the other bigger series, which you could argue does have some possible violence in some of the cutscenes, so it might not count. But Professor Layton is very beloved puzzle series on the Nintendo DS. And then I couldn't play it anymore because it moved onto the Nintendo 3DS, and I didn't have a Nintendo 3DS. So I was quite forlorn that I couldn't finish the series, because there are another two after that, and then they stopped. But yeah, I think that's another game that me and my sister bonded over, because we used to play it with each other, because the puzzles were really hard. So you'd often be like going around to different family members and being like, "Can you help me solve this riddle?" or whatever. And it was just a really easily engaging game that anyone can kind of pick up and play, which is really fun. And it was just a lovely story. All the stories were like mysteries, and they were just lovely and quirky. And the art style for all the cutscenes was amazing as well, because they're all animated, and they're just lovely games. I love them, and the voice acting is brilliant, of course, as well. But yeah, those are the two most impactful ones in my gaming history, I think.
How about you, Jen?
For me, I don't know. Probably if you asked me a different day, I'd have a different answer. I think you're right. I think what you alluded to is that these games are shorter, and also you're not, you don't go on the same with in the game, in a non-violent game, because you've not got that threat of over you that you have, and
Yeah.
I think those two things can conspire to make it harder to form a sort of genuine connection and engagement with the story. But I've mentioned Gabriel Knight a couple of times, and I think that Gabriel Knight really has sucked me in, and in so much as I've really kind of got connected to the story. It's been something that I've kind of been thinking about, talking to to friends about, oh, you know, what do I do? How do I get through this bit? And I also, I mean, for me, it was quite interesting because the Gabriel Knight story looks at the sort of Holy Grail and talks a lot about. At that same time, I was really into the whole night, and doing a lot of associated as well as reading a young adult series about various gods. So I think for me it came at a time when there was a lot of other stuff sort of was there to shore it up relevance in my life. So it found, and it stuck with me, and I really engaged with it. So I didn't need the violence because the intellect puzzling and storyfying and story writing was something that kind of really helped. But I think it is really interesting actually, like that, you know, since then there's been other ones. Like I think, you know, I know we've discounted what became of Edith Finch, but those kind of games, they create a feeling in you. And even if they're only just a couple of hours, you can still connect with them deeply. Her story was another one where, I mean, you could argue that there was violence in that because, but it was never explicit, or, you know, there was no threat, because it's all historical videos that you're looking at, and that was a really simple concept, but it had a really profound feeling and had an emotional impact on me. So I think it's about, like all these things, music actually, there's a lot about what else is going on in your life at the time, how relevant a game becomes to you, and how did you become to a game is not just about the content of the game. It can be about, you know, the right game at the right, just like the right song at the right time can just be the song. And so yeah, but for me, I think it'd probably be Gabriel Knight and maybe The Sims. But I don't feel like I can say that you get emotionally connected with The Sims, because it's, yeah, it doesn't work like that.
Just to add on to Jem's point about games like Edith Finch and stuff, I think those types of games also really spark my curiosity. They have something in them that makes you want to find out what's going to happen next, and like to see what's just around the corner, or like what's in this room. And you know, it makes you want to explore, which I love as a feeling. I love exploring in games. It's one of my favorite things. I'm always a bit of a completionist anyway. I like to tidy the map. But even if you don't have a map, I still like games that compel me to want to find out what's going on and like what's behind the story. So I think those are real drivers for me, definitely. And that's kind of, I guess, where I form a connection.
I have to say, Jem, Gabriel Knight sounds like a character from a saucy romance novel.
I think
like,
it was. He certainly. I think he thought he was.
it's just like Sebastian Grey from 50 Shades of Grey. That's what it made me think of. We'll get on to, so you mentioned curiosity is a really potent aspect of games that don't have this, because what violence is, you know, combat is, it's a gameplay mechanic that you can use to just tread water between story beats and actions like that. Also, that being one element, we'll come on to more about what these kind of games need in order to be compelling. We'll come on to that a bit later.